Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for coming. This is a larger room, so if people want to move a little forward, because it's very spread out at this point, that would be great. For this session, we have Robert Weisberg is going to be the speaker, and he is going to be talking about it doesn't have to be toxic when empathy is your workplace secret weapon. Robert is the Senior Project Manager in the Publications and Editorial Department at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He primarily handles tech and workflow tasks on exhibition and collection catalogs at the Met until a couple of years ago when he became more involved in labels. Oh, labels. As well. It's because I'm short and it's far away. So he handled exhibition and collection catalogs at the Met until a couple of years ago when he became more involved in labels, as well as participating in several print-digital hybrid projects. In addition to his technology and process work, he mediated between different museum and workplace cultures and styles in a variety of roles, both in his job and through participating in museum staff organizations. Ultimately, to quote Winona Ryder in Heathers, he just wants his school to be a nice place. He blogs about museums and organizational culture at robertjweisberg.com and invites you to attend the Muse Blog Unconference for Views Your Own Museum Field Bloggers today at noon, which is going to be upstairs in Proteus, or Proteus/Zulu. And recently participated in a medium series of exchanges with, actually, me, called Sticky Words, the Contentious Vocabulary of Museum Practice. So I'm going to hand it over to Robert.
Thank you. It's a big crowd to talk about toxicity, so we must be doing something right. So this is also known as, get this right. Yes. All right, so this is also known as how to implement a design thinking oriented process when you don't have the kind of workplace culture that you can implement a design thinking process. So I'm going to show how we rebooted the Met's label making program over a 3-year period and highlighting similarities between the stages of a design thinking process and what we actually did at the Met. Because no matter how much of a formal DT process you can undertake, the ingredients of design thinking, empathy, collaboration, listening, testing, and doing it all over again as you need to, that worked wonders with the way that the Met gets labels on the walls and will help you with a lot of workplace problems that need reinvention. You only need faith in your goals and faith in your colleagues. So first, a little bit of a background about labels at the Met. Across our 3 buildings, Fifth Avenue, the Cloisters, and the newly opened Met Breuer, we have about 50,000 objects on view. So that's about 60,000 labels of all kinds. And we produce about 5,000 new labels every year, including for exhibitions, rotations, and installations. And those include 350 label jobs, as well as requests from curators to revise a single label that somebody doodled on while online for something. So this is where it all started for me. I was able to attend a meeting of the curatorial body at the museum back in 2013 when our then new head of design was starting. And when the time came for questions, the head of this curator group got up and said, "Labels," and the whole room just went, "Ugh." So 170 curators doing that, you know you've got something that you need to fix. Now, I'd spent most of my time at the museum working on exhibition catalogs, but the head of our content management system group, the head of our sort of TMS team, asked me if I could help arrange some demos that the TMS company was interested in showing us for a way to link up TMS to our InDesign label workflow. And since I was kind of the technologist in the publications department, I was happy to help. So over the course of Late 2013 and early 2014, I brought in editors. I got together some designers from our design department, and these demos were shown to them, curators, admins, the typesetters from our print services department. And what we discovered over the course of these technology demos was that what seemed like a technology problem was actually a process problem. People were pointing fingers, project managers were pointing fingers at other project managers, multiple departments were involved in this, no one was really in charge of it. So we didn't feel we could go very far with proposing an expensive technology system when the workflow was so non-existent. So the tail of workflow began wagging the dog of technology, and for my trouble in pointing this out, I was half assigned, half volunteered to reboot our label workflow. But I had a few obstacles to overcome. I had no budget, authority, we had no downtime. There's never a time when labels aren't being made. We had no best practices to work from. We had no consistency. We had no culture of things of being regularly improved upon. And we had no tradition of project management. And I'm saying that as a project manager. So we had a few obstacles that we were going to have to overcome. So enter design thinking. Now I've come to, over the course of while I was working on this, I actually knew more about the design thinking process. The definition I really like as a workflow geek is looking at a process with creativity, teamwork, and empathy, and designing something better and respectful of people. In my technology role in the publications department, I learned pretty quickly that my job was 5% technology and 95% unlicensed psychotherapy. And we didn't really have a culture of workshopping, of whiteboards, of sticky notes. So this was going to be a process problem and a people problem to solve. Or how do you make design thinking work when you can't follow the normal practice? So what I'm going to do is go through the steps of design thinking while also pointing out the actual work that we did at the Met. There's a lot of articles now about design thinking. One that I really liked was by Demi and Borba from Adobe, Design Thinking, a Manual for Innovation. There's also, I'll have at the end of my deck a lot of links that people can download for articles on design thinking and on empathy. But so starting in with the first step, empathize. So we had a three-person team, the head of the TMS group, the newly hired project manager in the design department, and me. And we were going to be the ones starting on this process. But we had to do in a way that was respectful to our colleagues and allowed them to do their best work in order to bring the best possible labels to our visitors. So I want to keep coming back to empathy over the course of this. If you meditate at all, you know that coming back to the breath is the way that you sort of recenter yourself whenever your thoughts tend to stray. And empathy, like the breath, was sort of what I kept coming back to over the course of this process. I like this quote. Daniel H. Pink has written a lot about empathy in a few different books, but I like the end of this, that it makes the world a better place. You should be doing this because it's the right thing to do for your colleagues, for your visitors, for your institution. But as we all know, like doing the right thing for our institution can sometimes be a thankless task. So how can you make empathy into a workplace practice? And step one, get to know your peeps. There's nothing that takes the place of listening and going out and meeting with everyone who's working on this process. So we actually sort of went on a listening and reading tour, not just talking with all of our colleagues about what they did, how they did it, why they did it that way, and asking these questions in a way that didn't get us lots of defensive stares back. But also we read thousands of emails. We asked to be CC'd on every email thread about labels. We went through all of our servers and all of our files to see how things were organized. We looked at memos from 10 years ago, 15 years ago about let's reorganize the label process. Let's do this great technology thing. Clearly people had been thinking about this for a while, and those had kind of vanished into the mists of history and paper memos. And as I said, not everything has to be in real life. You can actually learn a lot by getting CC'd on everything. So be prepared to get thousands of angry emails that you're being CC'd on. The TMS manager actually spoke to every single curatorial department to ask about the way that they used TMS to get material into the label workflow. And we started hearing a lot of, well, that's the way it always has been, or that's the way things always happen at the Met. And when you hear that, don't automatically dismiss it. There's often a kernel of truth in it, or it's meant in the best way. So after a few months, we sort of compared notes and saw what we'd learned. And the main problem was the lack of faith in the entire process. Entire curatorial departments were actually making their own labels. Typesetting them, editing them themselves, and not really because of the large exhibitions, but because small label jobs would just vanish into the ether. 1 or 2 labels they would submit, and a year later they would ask what happened to them, which is also part of the problem. But they would find out that people had just never bothered to work on it, and no one knew where it was anymore. Version control was an absolute nightmare, and I know we all have version control problems, but this was really bad. Everyone was emailing InDesign files around to each other. So there's sort of the problem. Folders on the server were named for people and not galleries, not exhibitions. So to from editor X, to from designer Y. Email was really just a conduit for backbiting and anger, and not exactly a good use for email. So we moved on to the next step. So I've seen this part of design thinking worded a couple of different ways. Some people put ideate before define, some people put define before ideate. To me, define is where you make sure that you really know what problem you're trying to solve. Ideate is where you gather as much information as you can from all of your colleagues about what they would want to do to fix this process. I think if you can't really explain clearly the difference in these steps, you're best off sort of treating them together at the same time or allowing them to overlap, and that's okay. But the key with ideate is to get intentional and directed information. Not just sort of random ideas, but try to get them to be focused on the problem that you're trying to solve. So from my experience during this process, these two very much overlapped. So I'm sort of treating them as one opportunity to fix mindset. That sort of shrugging of shoulders when you tell people you want to fix things. One of the first things we went after was language. There was a tremendous variation in how different people referred to the same groups of labels. Labeled jobs might be named by gallery, might be named by department, might be named by the wing of the museum, by the rotation, by a job ticket number, by some other number. The terminology, lexicon, and nomenclature, which people used interchangeably, of course, was the first thing that we needed to address. So we tried to get everyone speaking the same terminology over the same parts of the process. We tried to clear up misunderstandings, malapropisms, and myths. So you'll find yourself doing a lot of translating during this process. A common part of design thinking at this stage is looking at the needs that you're hearing and trying to express those as relatively simple verbs. Then matching those up to the insights that you bring to the process, the things that you can understand from your perspective that the person who's right in the middle of it may not be able to see. So a handful of these that we wrote down at this point, when people were talking about simplifying, they actually weren't talking about the process as much as they didn't want to be using systems that they were unfamiliar with. Or as some senior person in the process told me, I don't want to use Basecamp on this. It's like, okay, we're not being hired by Basecamp, it's fine. When people were talking about backup, they weren't talking about new versions of the files. They were talking about, I want somebody to be able to back me up when I'm away, when I can actually take some vacation. So we saw that as a flexibility problem, as more people being able to do different tasks in the process. And when people talked about the need for tracking, they were talking about these tiny label jobs, dozens of which we might have on our calendar at any one time. When our designers were talking about compliance, they're talking about Americans with Disabilities Act and the fact that curators weren't necessarily interested that a label had to be legally placed at a certain place to make them easier to read. So we did this sort of mapping of terminology so we could understand what the problems actually were with the process. One other book I want to mention, one other source I want to mention is called The Power of Habit, Why We Do What We Do in Life and Business. It's actually a good thing for nail biting and other sort of, and gambling and a lot of psychological habits. But we were seeing a lot of negative habits. And basically what you try to do is you take a negative habit and you replace it with a positive routine. But in order to have a routine, you kind of need a best practice. So we were trying to put people in positions to succeed by creating best practices that existing staff, and especially new staff could point to when they came in. So the first thing we were trying to do was to get rid of the personality-based systems and workflows, and without making people feel like corporate robots, which of course are the worst kind of robots. So at this point, once you have your definitions in place, and once you've collected as many ideas as you think are useful, you need to move on to the prototype stage, where you actually do something and build something and show something to the group. As somebody who endlessly loves to plan things, this was psychologically a different step for me. I'd always feel, we're not ready for this. So this is the first flowchart I came up with for our new workflow. And I found myself getting the exact same groans that the curators were getting about the label process. And then I realized that a flowchart like this is a dare to yourself, that you can actually fill up an entire glyphy sort of virtual flowchart space with something, I think it was like 75, 80 steps. Needless to say, this was not going to get presented to anyone senior. So this is kind of where you get the real bite, the real pushback from people when you're trying to present. This actually is not from The Muppet Show. It's a line that I wrote myself. But this is where you yourself have to not absorb the defensiveness of your colleagues when you're questioning why they're doing the work in the way that they're doing it. So again, empathy, back to the breath, back to empathy. You're doing this for the right reasons, your colleagues, your visitors, and sort of take courage in that. And no, turning it into swim lanes, an 8-foot wide swim lane chart doesn't help either. That's such a flattering picture. And yes, that actually is an 8-foot long flow chart. So what we started to do was break the job into smaller pieces. These are sort of hard to see, but I'm trying to sort of indicate what we allowed people to do. So our design department put together a new status report on their end. They were tracking 160 design exhibition building tasks at the same time. My department, the publications department, put together our own tracking sheet of about 100 label projects. We would meet every week to sort of discuss what was going on with these two sheets. But if Excel was working for people, we didn't force them to use something else. We also did create new servers, new templates. Every folder in our entire label system is now exactly the same, has the same 4 or 5 subfolders in it. No more emailing files around under penalty of 8-foot long flow charts. So this step, we rolled out sort of new status reports, and at least the core team all seemed to be taking these really, really well. The senior staff we mentioned this to also seemed to be appreciative of the organization we were trying to bring to the process. So revisiting the earlier needs and insights chart, we started mapping those to the fixes that we were making. We were sticking with Excel, but now all of the charts really had somebody owning the process. Improving communication. We noticed that one of the worst things that was happening was that the label editor and the curator would be having one set of conversations. The curator and the designer would be having another set of conversations. The two were never being reconciled, so needless to say, the editor would be turning in text that the designer hadn't really spec'd properly, in terms of what went in what order on the tombstone. We have tombstones in different orders, that's another problem. We put a common server together. Design started having Americans with Disability Act discussions early on in the process. And our weekly status meetings wouldn't end until we made sure that we knew the location and status of every single tiny label job. And we could still do this in 45 minutes. It didn't require like a 4-hour meeting at all. And then it's time to test your actual prototype. Another good quote, never fall in love with your ideas. Somebody who always falls in love with their ideas, this was also a very hard step for me as well. As you enter these testing phases, especially when you don't really have any downtime, you have to detach from your ideas. Or as someone said to me, so if this workflow doesn't work, the labels won't get on the walls, right? You're like, no, of course the labels will get on the walls. We'll fix the workflow. So we worked on a couple of small label jobs when it was time for the 2015 Costume Institute Met Gala. That is one of the worst possible label tasks to deal with at the Met. By nature, it's a large show, it's late, always lots and lots of changes. I didn't realize this about sort of fashion-oriented exhibitions, but when you open up the box, it may not be the dress that you thought it was going to be. So we got a lot of last-minute label changes. And did it work? It did not work. I set the same 300 labels 3 times. People telling me, I told you so. It was the first of many meltdowns over the first few months of this testing stage. My plan had been for the editors and the designers to take up the typesetting of the labels. That's what the templates were designed to do. I was told I would be doing all the typesetting for the labels. That's about 4,500 labels to typeset a year. That was a bit of a bummer, but I felt I could handle it. But most of all, we were tweaking the workflow on a regular basis. These weekly meetings, actually, we would make changes with the workflow at every one of our status meetings. But then we would write down what we'd done, and it became part of our best practice. We were replacing bad habits with good routines. Then we started learning the secret tasks that we didn't really know about, or as people like to call it, institutional knowledge. I'm for all institutional knowledge. I've been at the Met a while. I like to think I have institutional knowledge. But it seems to be a lot of, this is stuff that people don't write down, whether deliberately or psychologically, I don't know. Some of these tasks that we didn't really find out about were, our communications department asked for exports of the finished labels so that they could put together press materials. The curators asked for exports so that they could copy and paste it from the label copy into TMS, which actually was funny because it sort of went back to the point of the original demo years earlier. We put together booklets of large print labels for also whether it's part of the ADA or not, so that people who couldn't easily read labels on the walls in our exhibitions would have a booklet that they could look from. But again, we sort of rolled with it. The workflow wasn't about stopping doing these things, it was about being able to bring these sort of intelligently into the process that we were trying. And that's where the last step of design thinking comes in, and that's the repeat step. You go back to your phases and you keep iterating one phase at a time. So 5,000 labels, a lot of opportunities to test and improve. And again, since we were doing this it was about routines and not about blaming anyone for the process. So a couple years later, where are we? We've rebuilt the trust with curatorial. There's no more blame inside of the process any longer. There's no more pointing of fingers internally. When somebody sends a nasty email to someone else on the team, people really are like, damn, because it's a rare enough occasion, it's a rare enough event that we really notice it and can deal with it on the spot. New staff, when they come in, only know about the best practices. And that is really gratifying when people think that's the way you've always done it. Sense of overwork and always being behind, not sure that's ever going to really change in museum work. The rogue departments are still kind of doing their own thing. We're hoping to bring that all in-house in a way that doesn't drown us in work. And a habit is to not write something down when it's 7 or 8 o'clock at night. So that's a habit that we have to keep fighting against. And this nightmarish swim lane became this. 9 steps with the help of some curators who told me fewer steps, fewer steps, fewer steps. And I've been working on 7 or 8 label projects at once since the spring. It's become my primary job at the Met. We've hired many new people. Some people have left. But we have a baseline practice that makes sense. So I presented this flowchart to a group of about 50 curators back in May and saw that the had turned into an ah. So lessons learned over this period, and while this is on the screen, I just want to read a quote that I found sort of really kind of meaningful. If you're a leader, do what you want to be part of them. Do you want to be part of them or we? If it's the latter, then it's important to consider creativity isn't all about you, meaning you're not the fount of the best ideas. Instead, you're the person who brings your team together. You are the person who models the importance of learning, the generosity of sharing, rather than needing to be right. You welcome heated conversations about ideas because that's when inspiration happens, and you applaud staff passionate enough to stand up for what they believe in. Creative frameworks don't change museums because process doesn't change organizations. People do. And that's Joan Baldwin in the Leadership Matters blog. The article, Is Your Museum an Idea Factory? That's all about valuing principles over people. There's a reason I put that number 1. Get rid of blame, build new stories to change the culture, and share your journey with your colleagues. Most of all, don't mistake the workflow for the actual people. Don't have meetings where you say, isn't this new workflow great? That's not what it's about. Because people, not systems, make labels. And we didn't treat people as label makers. Every colleague is a possible ally, assuming they want things to get better, maybe even if they don't. And you may get back a little empathy in return. This is actually a label that our design department made for a sort of group breakfast about 1.5 years into the process. This is hanging on the wall in my department, and it's, I think, the sweetest thing I've ever seen in my years at the Met. So I have a lot of sources here. In my deck, there's actual links to all of these. The Stanford Design School is so much good information about design thinking there. I just want to point out something near the bottom, A New Earth. It's everything your parents ever told you about new agey stuff, but it's a really great book about roles and not getting sort of addicted to roles and really being a person when you're dealing with different relationships in life, but also in your work. And again, I can go through these if anyone has wants any more sources. So I want to thank everyone for coming out to listen to Toxicity early in the morning, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
So just one thing before questions. For the recording, you can ask the questions. You're going to have to shout them because it's kind of a big room. But we'll need to say the question again, which I know feels repetitive, but it's for the recording.
Hey, I am wondering if you have any tips for managing upward when it comes to labels. When you have chief curator still doing shows, and she's super busy, and her labels are always a month late. How do we kind of get around the top down?
All right, so it's the classic question in our field, managing upwards, certainly without authority, whether it's to senior curators or senior staff. Again, starts with empathy. Try to feel for why they're always, once you sort of understand that they're generally not weeks late because they're nasty people, they have a lot of their own pressures and you're trying to make the system work for them. We still have curators who are very late with turning in labels, and the best thing we found about that process is getting the team to be able to react intelligently and not sort of have a breakdown over how late things are coming in. If you have a good enough workflow and it's done for the right reasons, you can sort of push that awareness of that upwards, maybe not to that exact curator, but maybe to other curators. Curators do talk and sometimes adopt habits of others. Senior staff may start to see what you're accomplishing. But that's one of the things we're still working on, is how to deal with curators turning in things late. And again, it's the resiliency of the team that you want to start with. Other questions? Anyone over here? Mm-hmm.
That they're not going to be frustrated by constantly having to change what they're doing, especially in a large organization.
Right. So it's a question about the iteration step and how to get people as the process changes. What you're saying is, as the process changes, I guess how to get people to sort of give up the defensiveness that things are changing a lot while they're working. We heard so many. The phrase, that's the way it's always been done at the Met, was seared into our brain. We heard that so many times. We still hear that so many times. It's this kind of exceptionalism that can be really frustrating when you first hear it. I think, again, you're looking at the team that you're working with. Use those regular meetings or those opportunities to write things down to sort of make sure everyone's agrees on the steps that you're taking. And I would say ask it again, because things that you write down in a status meeting when somebody's actually trying to get a label typeset because it needs to go on the walls that night, people get into that habit of they're taking shortcuts, and you're just trying to get to a point where you don't want that shortcut to be reinforced. So again, it's about talking it through. At your status meetings, encourage people to say at the status meeting what just happened the past week that didn't work. And when you find that out, if you're putting your colleagues ahead of the workflow, you hear that enough and you'll start to make tweaks to deal with that. So again, it's really just a process of talking it through and writing it down. Hi, question over here?
Was your problem more design based, in the look of label itself, or was it content based?
It was actually neither. And one of the, my 85 slide version talked about the development of the content was actually happening on a separate track, and a different task force is actually looking at the way that the actual words get developed. Ours was more of a design problem, and even beyond the look, it was just the production of it. It was really a production problem. I'd sort of hoped at the beginning of the process that all the labels except the bespoke special exhibitions would actually start to look the same. Saban is, not the most, to my mind, not the most wonderful font ever. That's something we're still working on. And I think We didn't want to use up all of our capital in forcing every curatorial department to have their labels look exactly the same. We were trying to encourage them to have faith in the process we were putting together so that we could then say, and we'd like to make some changes to the look of the labels. But it was actually more, it was closer to design, but I'd say it was actually more of a production process problem. Question over here?
I have a question for you about hierarchy. And if you've encountered the issue of, there's this whole notion of service departments, non-service departments. And in my mind, we're all service departments because we're all working in
Right.
the museum.
Right.
But when you have a project like this that goes through several departments,
Right.
and you have certain departments that are withholding information because they sort of are able to maintain control and not be the service department. And there's this kind of
Right.
versus them. How do you
Yeah.
deal with that?
You talk to them a lot. You get to know them, you let them get to know you. If you're new to the process, you'll be seen as a bit of an outsider. I had a bit of a brand as sort of the unlicensed psychotherapist, so I seem to be fairly good at getting people to spill who else they hated. So it's that, that seemed to be useful. I think again, it's about talking with people as much as possible. Withholding information is a huge problem, so you don't do it. Try to make a positive example of it. But again, 3 of us were doing the sort of the listening tour and the reading tour. When we all sort of compared notes, there were enough processes that we could kind of get involved in, that we could start to make some positive changes. One of the things we actually did was, originally there were 4 departments working on labels. One of the first things we did was we proposed to one of the departments that they let our department handle it. That was in terms of the actual typesetting of the labels. And I was really worried that somebody was going to say, but that's all that I do. And they were all too happy to not have to set all of these labels. So we brought the team a little bit tighter. But again, it just goes back to the more talking that you can do, the more that you open up the process, the more open the process is, the more that people are willing to talk about it. Eventually the defensiveness starts to subside, but it takes time. Any other questions while Jennifer's checking the time?
We can take one very quick because the next session has to go.
One more question over there.
Would you be willing to share your work with documentation and best practices?
Yeah, I'm happy to gather that all together. We have a.
Had a request for the slide deck.
Okay. What's that?
There was a request for the slide deck.
Okay. Yeah, and write to me. My email's up there. I'm happy to send you the slide deck, and I'm happy to send you the best practices if I myself am sure which is the most recent version. Keep track of your best practices. I can't emphasize that enough. But I'm happy to talk through any part of the process with you. All right. Thank you all.